Episode 1. The Warning. When the American minister, Mr. Hiram B. Otis, bought the large old house called Canterville Chase, everyone told him that he was very foolish. Even Lord Canterville, who wanted to sell the house, tried to tell Mr. Otis that it was a mistake to buy it.
"I must be honest with you, Mr. Otis,"
said Lord Canterville.
"There is something very strange about this house. My family and I don't stay here very often."
"But what is so strange about the place?"
asked Mr. Otis.
"There is a ghost here,"
said Lord Canterville.
"It visits anyone who lives or stays here. My poor old aunt, the Dowager Duchess of Bolton, once felt 2 hands on her shoulders as she dressed for dinner. The hands were cold and hard, like the hands of a skeleton. My poor aunt was very frightened. She became ill, and she never really got better. That is why my family and I do not like to stay here anymore."
"Did anyone else see the ghost?"
asked Mr. Otis.
"The Reverend Augustus Dampier also saw it,"
said Lord Canterville.
"Dampier went to Cambridge University, you know. He's very clever, and not the kind of man who imagines things."
"No, of course not,"
said Mr. Otis.
"After the terrible thing that happened to my dear aunt, most of our servants left the house and didn't want to come back here to work. My poor wife, Lady Canterville, could not sleep at night. She was frightened, and of course the strange noises that we hear in the halls and in the library make us even more afraid."
"I'm not afraid,"
said Mr. Otis.
"I want to take the house and the ghost. I come from a modern country, where we have everything that money can buy. There is nothing in Europe that we don't have in America. If there were ghosts, we would have some too. And there are no ghosts in America, you know."
Lord Canterville smiled.
"I'm afraid that the ghost is real,"
he said.
"It is more than 300 years old, for members of my family first saw it in 1584. Shortly before any member of my family dies, the ghost appears."
Mr. Otis laughed.
"I'm sorry,"
he said,
"but I don't believe in ghosts. There is no such thing."
"Well,"
smiled Lord Canterville,
"I hope you are happy in the house. But you must remember that I warned you, and you did not listen to me."
Episode 2. Blood in the Library. Mr. Otis bought Canterville Chase, and a few weeks later he moved into the house with his family. Mr. Otis's wife, Lucretia, was a handsome woman and was always in good health. Their eldest son, whose name was Washington, was a fair-haired, good-looking young man. His sister Virginia was 15. She was slim and beautiful, with large blue eyes. After Virginia came the twins, who were lovely little boys, but they liked to play tricks on people. It was a lovely July evening. The family enjoyed the evening sun as they travelled towards the house. However, as they got near to Canterville Chase, the sky became dark and big drops of rain began to fall. An old woman stood in front of the house. Her name was Mrs. Umney, and she was the housekeeper at Canterville Chase.
Welcome to Canterville Chase,
she said.
I have tea ready for you in the library.
The family followed her through the large hall into the library. The library was a long room with a large stained glass window at one end. There was a dark red stain on the floor near the fire.
Something has been spilt here,
said Mrs. Otis.
Yes, madam.
Mrs. Umney said quietly.
That is blood.
How horrible!
Cried Mrs. Otis.
I don't want blood on my floors.
Mrs. Umney smiled.
That is the blood of Lady Eleanor de Canterville. Her husband, Sir Simon de Canterville, murdered her there in 1575. Sir Simon disappeared suddenly 9 years later. No one ever found his body, but his ghost haunts this house. No one can clean the blood from the floor.
That's silly,
cried Washington.
I can clean it up right now with Pinkerton's stain remover.
He took a small black stick from his pocket and rubbed at the stain with it. The blood quickly disappeared.
You see?
He cried.
I knew Pinkerton could do it.
Just then a terrible flash of lightning lit up the room, and there was a loud crash of thunder. Mrs. Umney fell to the floor.
What terrible weather they have in this country,
said Mr. Otis.
My dear Hiram,
cried Mrs. Otis.
what can we do with a woman who faints?
We can take money from her wages every time she faints,
said Mr. Otis. When Mrs. Umney heard this, she sat up. She was very unhappy.
You must not make the ghost angry, sir,
she said.
Terrible things happen in this house.
But Mr. Otis and his wife were not afraid.
We don't believe in ghosts,
Ghosts.
They said.
But we would like some tea.
Episode 3. The Ghost Appears. The storm continued all night long, but nothing strange happened, and the family slept quite well. However, the next morning, when they came downstairs for breakfast, they found the terrible stain on the library floor again.
I don't believe it,
said Washington.
It must be the ghost.
He rubbed at the stain a second time, but the next morning it appeared again. That night, Mr. Otis locked the library and took the key to bed with him, but the stain was there again the next day. The whole family were now quite interested. Even Mr. Otis began to think that there might be a ghost at Canterville Chase, and that night he became completely sure. It was a warm and sunny day, and in the evening, when it was cool, the family went out for a drive. They came home at 9 o'clock and had a light supper. They talked about famous actresses and actors, and about the foods they missed from America that they could not get in England. They did not talk about ghosts at all, and no one mentioned Sir Simon Canterville. At 11 o'clock, the family went to bed. By 11:30, everyone was asleep, and the house was dark. But suddenly, a strange noise woke Mr. Otis. The noise came from the hall outside his bedroom and sounded like the clank of metal. Mr. Otis got up, lit a candle, and looked at the clock. It was exactly 1 o'clock. He felt very calm and was not at all worried. He could still hear the strange noise, and now He could also hear footsteps. Mr. Otis took a small bottle from the table next to his bed. He opened his bedroom door and saw a terrible sight. There was an old man in the hall with red eyes and long grey hair. His clothes were old, dirty and torn, and there were chains around his wrists and ankles.
My dear sir,
said Mr. Otis,
your chains are making a terrible noise. You really must oil them.
He showed the man the small bottle.
This is a bottle of Tammany Rising Sun Lubricator,
he said.
It's just what you need.
Mr. Otis put the bottle of oil on a table near the ghost, then went back into his bedroom and fell asleep again.